you also have to help support your team with retraining. So I think a lot of that comes down, what I observe is you can build your team up with, some of those softer stakeholder skills.
P2P podcast. Real leaders, real lessons. Real talk on the future of purchase to pay for finance, procurement, and GBS leaders who care about what works, not what sounds good.
Today's guest is Molly Dausch. Molly started a career leading sourcing and supply chain teams. Over time, she moved into the world of global business services and purchase to pay, where she's focused on improving how processes run across large, complex organizations. As global process owner for P2P in Zimmer Biomet, she's responsible for standardizing and optimizing how procurement, finance, and shared services work together. Today, we are driving into what it really takes to drive change in P2P, such as how the GPO role can create impact, where companies have the biggest opportunities to improve, and what's next for automation, collaboration, and leadership in this space. Molly, welcome to this podcast. So you've been in P2P for a while. What brought you into this field, and what's kept you really engaged over the years in your tenure?
Okay. Thanks, Lawrence. Happy to be here. So what's brought me to P2P? I spent probably the first 10, 12 years of my career in supply chain and sourcing roles. So I always worked for really large global Fortune 500 manufacturers. So I worked for Goodyear Tire and Rubber. I worked for WestRock. I worked for Alcoa. In those organizations, I was, either doing, I really started from the ground up, did analytics work, did planning work, led sourcing teams, led larger sourcing teams. Ultimately, whenever I was with Alcoa, I was leading a lot of large global sourcing teams, worked with a lot of corporate customers, heavily supported our GBS organization. And the GBS president at the time that I interacted with a lot asked me to consider a GPO role as their P2P role opened up. It ended up being a very nice transition from leading sourcing teams to going behind the scenes and entering the GBS world in a source to pay GPO role.
Very, very nice. Big introduction to that, and lovely to hear how you got engaged over all these years. So let's unpack this a little bit about yourself. If someone had to ask you to explain in one sentence, without using, the business jargon out there nowadays, explain this to us without the jargon.
Yeah, I think to the layman, it's really hard to describe what a P2P leader or GPO does. So I would probably say most simplistically, I help, I lead the teams and the processes, the systems that help large companies buy and pay efficiently and compliantly. Probably the simplest way to say it.
Simplest way. Yeah, I think that's very good. What's one experience or lesson that's had the biggest impact in how you see P2P today?
This is tough. I think, so I've been a GPO now for 8 years in different companies. And, I've always looked after P2P. I've looked after I2C as well. But, specifically in P2P, I think something that maybe two things that shaped the way I look at P2P that I learned earlier on and was fortunate to learn earlier on is that you have to get really comfortable with change. And that you can't let organizational structure, technology change, leadership change, impact or, concern you to an extent that you can't thrive. You really have to be super comfortable with change. And then I would say a very switch onto the other side, a very practical thing that I learned early in P2P. When you look after sensitive processes like payments and vendor master data, you learn to be on high alert for, fraud, concern, misuse, compliance. So, two very different pieces, but ones that I learned early that have a really big impact on how I look at P2P.
So if we look at the change fundamentals of the organization, specifically where you reside, if you can maybe share something about your approach that really shaped how you lead and solve the problems in change, let's unpack that a little bit. If there's maybe something you can share with us.
Yeah, I like that question. And I'll kind of lean back to a time when I first became a GPO, and I think it helped shape the way I kind of look at things going forward. So I think there's, anyone that's in GBS long enough knows that there's, a big mentality around, shifting work, lifting work, FTE sizing, right sizing, capacity, et cetera. I think one of the first things I was tasked with when I first became a GPO a number of years ago was to redesign the organization, because for different reasons it was not functional. It wasn't working. And I think the thing that I learned in that redesign was, people are much more successful, teams are much more successful, leaders are much more successful, the less we think about this FTE mentality of, the size means something, or the number of people that I'm managing means, and not to say that doesn't mean something, but like to get hung up on, I used to have an organization this size, now I have an organization this size. I think, that really slows down good decision making and hinders good decision making, and, prevents you from getting to the optimal structure. So I think, I spent, a week at one of my centers and was going through org design, and, we kind of had to iterate through this obstacle of, leaders naturally getting hung up on this FTE, piece of it. And, once we could get past that and think about, optimal design versus, legacy teams or legacy organizations or legacy ownership, we got so much more productive and became, our output was way more of the best design at that point in time for the organization we were at that point in time. So I think getting, there's just a lot of freedom in focusing on the best design versus, this FTE mentality.
So if we have to go a little bit further into this, and I want to reflect a little bit on leadership, how big is that impact when you have to implement this change and transformation? What is their approach, and how do leadership in general look at this, and how do they support you at the end of the day?
And you're asking about, how do people view these changes at a leadership level? Yes. Looking at, okay. Well, I think that that's the expectation. I think that, if in various times when I've asked to redesign a P2P team or to, separate, where our company's separating, can you help separate our GBS organizations? How's that going to look? I think the expectation is that we bypass some of this kind of, smaller thinking around, legacy ownership and team sizes and structure. I mean, if we're doing our jobs well, we're giving them the best team structures. And, that would be the expectations, to design what's going to work best for the organization at that point in time. I think for me, it's, it's a constant for me that I recognize, I think in a GBS world that an organization structure, has a natural expiration. You evolve, your processes change, your business change, et cetera. So you have to be dynamic and adjust to that. But I think that leadership has, at least my leadership has always had an expectation that I'm delivering an optimal design versus, focusing on, FTEs or legacy, people and ownership of different processes.
Yeah. And definitely, I think at the end of the day, technology, processes, and people, these are really important aspects to make sure that they do align to what you want to execute at the end of the day. So let's look a little bit into the reality of P2P today. So looking at P2P versus when you started 7-8 years ago, which is quite a lot of years, what's changed the most, and what stayed surprisingly the same for you?
Yeah. I'm surprised. So one of the things that I'm surprised that has stayed the same is, there's still a lot of antiquated, requisition writing requirements. There's still a lot of, labor involved in, putting a rec together, I think. I'm surprised, and there's technologies that are coming along and supporting that. I guess I'm surprised that hasn't progressed more quickly in the time that I've been, in this space. Some of the areas that have changed a lot that I probably am, still wrapping my arms around are all of the dynamic e-invoicing requirements in Europe and LATAM, and those messages are, at least for me, are changing quite a bit about, when do you need to have exactly what in place by what date? So that's been something that's evolved in the last, 5-7 years that, I didn't necessarily, expect, or, that has changed quite a bit. I think areas where I've been pleased about progress, I think that tools like, optical character recognition has developed a lot. So, what we were using 5 years ago is a lot different than what we're using now. The AI-driven OCR versus the prior rules-based OCR is better. I think watching some of the OCR systems that we're using today and watching the system learn the invoice structure. So you show it the invoice, it doesn't recognize the POs in the top right versus the left right, or the left sheet of the invoice, and you teach it the second time and now it's recognizing. And so that's exciting to see, like some of those more sophisticated ways that we're taking in invoices. That's been something I've been pleased about in recent years.
Fantastic. And if we look at the OCR process and how it's evolved, I do recognize that you say, the AI can teach itself to start looking at the documents in a different way. But I'm sure there's still certain challenges that does happen, especially specifically if you receive the information in different formats and OCR doesn't recognize it. Yeah. Does that have a big impact into the process and organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've changed OCR systems, which isn't too difficult to do, it's an achievable task, and you can be done, within somewhat of a reasonable time frame, less than a year, my experience. But you are making an investment in whatever tool you're going with, because now, if it's AI driven, you want to make sure that you have enough runway to really let the system learn. But my feeling is, if you're a huge company with thousands of vendors, you're going to receive invoices in a lot of different ways. So there's a natural learning curve that's going to happen. And you can do a ton of planning and a ton of testing and a ton of, pre-work to prepare for that. But you still need to prepare for like the queue and exception management. So that's fairly significant. So you need to make sure that you're designing a process post go live that's ready, with a human in the loop to say, okay, here's the queue that's falling out, or, the system didn't get this. And you've got to really plan for with, whatever your IT support or, organization that's supporting that system, to go through and, have a clear feedback loop of how do we continue to re-educate and make sure that this queue gets smaller and smaller over time.
Yeah. So in other words, what you're saying to me is at the end of the day, you have a specific team set up that looks at the false positives and makes sure that those exceptions are taken care of. In other words, performing a little audit process on the actual tooling that's in place.
Absolutely. And my recommendation is that, if you are moving towards or changing, you need to make sure you're planning for that process and staffing accordingly.
Okay, great. So that brings me to my next question. So what's a discussion of P2P that you would say we need to have more often, but this is not being addressed in today's world?
This is more like a softer skill conversation, I think. But I think that people don't talk enough, maybe in recruitment, retention, they don't talk about that GBS as a whole can be a hard place to stay in, and P2P also can be a challenging place to stay in for a long time. And what I mean by that is I think there's a certain like talent profile that thrives in a P2P environment and a GBS environment. And I think that's not talked about as much, because I think, say your frontline's P2P and maybe you work in what I call a customer, service role. You're handling a lot of the troubleshooting that might come in through ServiceNow or whatever your mechanism is. That isn't always the easiest place to be. You're handling a lot of frustration, or you might be, maybe some thankless customers. So I think something that people don't talk about is the right talent profile that you need to stay in P2P long term.
So, but how do we then address this? Because talent is extremely important. And if you look at how everything is evolving, everything is changing, technology is changing, processes are changing, adaptation is important. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, change is important. But now you go through this process, you need to find talent that's aligned to the certain value that needs to be delivered in your business. I know you're saying, maybe recruitment, we need to address this a little bit more, but is there any advice that you can maybe share how we can pick this up? Is it a certain process that we need to take people through?
I think the the proactive way to look at it is recruitment, right? You hire for a talent profile. But the reactive way to do it is to also retrain and upskill. So like you have your existing workforce. So, and I think like you have these large GBS teams or large, however your support structure is, hybrid, BPO, whatever it might be. And what you want to do is create a nice balance in talent, right? You want to have, some senior level folks with X years experience. You can have some junior level folks that are learning from here. You want to have, a mix of, automation experience, a mix of, accounting expertise. So you're trying to build these perfect teams. And in that, you also want this personality profile of a person that's, content with change, thrives in a dynamic environment, someone that is patient. So all of that you can try to hire for, but, then you also have to think retroactively, you also have to help and support your team with retraining. So I think a lot of that comes down, what I observe is you can build your team up with, some of those softer stakeholder skills with, retrainings in that avenue. But I would also say a big element here is re-education back to your stakeholder base helps support your teams, because often some of the frustration is rooted in maybe miseducation or a lack of understanding of the P2P flow path. And I think, supporting your teams and, empowering them to help re-educate along the way, because sometimes those frustrations, are just a matter of, this is how you properly submit this requisition. This is how you properly have this invoice approved. Let me help walk you through that. And I think there's a bit of an empowerment when you show your teams that that's helpful and appropriate to help their organization understand that.
Yeah, very good points. And at the end of the day, people are key. They are really the driving force behind the success in your process. So there's a lot of trends that's currently happening in P2P. What would you say is a very big emerging trend that's currently happening for you that receives a lot of attention?
Yeah, we spoke a little bit about this, and I'm really excited about AI. And what we've seen in some of these sessions we're attending this week is that while everyone's talking about AI, there's probably less than a quarter of people doing anything about it yet. I think like a lot of people, organizations are learning about AI. What are the capabilities? What are the potential use cases? But also, organizations are getting bombarded with, partners to consider, deployment partners to talk about, solutions that they should or shouldn't work with, who's the best at this. So I think there's a lot of, learning still happening and assessing of what's the right decision to make. I think also companies are deciding, how do we keep, our security, our integrity? There's a lot of, policy related conversations. Personally, I think that the use cases in P2P are super exciting for organizations that maybe aren't, at the top of their maturity curve and still have a lot of standardization to go. I think the excitement and the long-term possibility is really significant. I think, whenever you watch some of these demos that are showcasing, agentic, responses in customer service, they're super exciting. The opportunity, whenever you watch it is clear. I think you have a lot of questions of, how do I have the confidence that the response is, looking at this data point, empathizing this other point. So there's a lot of questions, but I am very hopeful that it can be a very, big and significant impact in P2P. I think I'm more excited about AI than I was about RPA. I think RPA kind of did what I thought it would do, which was it was very helpful in a lot of, specific use cases.
Yeah, specifically probably around the manual processes it needs to play. RPA is definitely, I think that's where it really had an impact. But AI is definitely on a different trend, and it definitely, I think there is still a lot that needs to happen. But it is extremely exciting. It's exciting to see the impact of actually where we're going forward with this. If you had to share with us in terms of improving efficiency in P2P as of today, where would you say is the biggest opportunities for companies?
Well, I mean, I think I'll kind of use the use case that we were talking about just a second ago. I think that some of the biggest use cases are around removing some of the labor that's associated with internal and external responses. I think there's a big propensity for change there in terms of how much labor that you have sitting on top of that versus how much of that labor, moves into other reinvestments in your organization. I think that's really, really significant. I think, depending on where you're at in your spectrum, your ability to improve your touchless processing is always there. Companies that are still working on their end-to-end, buying and invoicing systems, how fully integrated is that? How much have you pushed your vendor base? There's a lot of improvement there. But I think the most, significant new piece is that, how much labor impact can you have in your responsiveness and your interactions with your internal and external customers?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, it depends on how many hands that go through at the end of the day.
Yeah.
What makes achieving full end-to-end visibility in P2P so difficult, and what's helping companies move closer?
Yeah. The time, that's a issue as old as time. I think there's always a challenge. And not just P2P, but in all of your towers, having good data visibility across all ERPs, all entities. I think in companies like I've worked in are, major, big manufacturers, lots of acquisition, lots of M&A work. So naturally you see, fragmented ERP structure. So, depending on your organization, you might have, some of that playing into it. You've got different organizational ownership. You might have had legacy fragmentation around data strategy. I think, one of the things that has helped me, looking at process mining tools. So some of the process mining tools out there are really, fairly quick to plug into, legacy ERP structures. So if you have a lot of ERPs and you want to quickly pull them in, process mining tools can help you. Also looked at process mapping tools to help map out your processes. And those have helped a lot. But I think one of the things that has helped me most is leaning into some process mining tools to aggregate data a little quicker than what I had done in the past.
Let's unpack the data visibility aspect that you just mentioned. So anything when it comes to process mining, the same with artificial intelligence, workflow, your data really needs to be up to date and clean, and there needs to be a lot of integrity into your data. How do you ensure that does stay maintained and cleaned so that these tools can actually have a proper impact at the end?
Yeah. And maybe one more thing that I'd mention around like what's preventing you from that is, oftentimes, attrition plays into that, where you have an SME of a certain system that really understood the data, and someone new comes in, they don't understand the interpretation of the data or what this field versus that field means. So I think that also plays into it. So I think, your question around how do you organize and make this data useful again? One, depending on what your objective is, right? So as a GPO, I want to see global data, but not everyone in my company cares or needs to see global data. So what I need to do is have really good regional data, because that's the way my company's going to want to absorb that. So I don't necessarily need to get bogged down on how do I make global data uniform. I should really focus on how do I make regional data usable, fast and quick for the leaders that need it that way. So then I typically end up finding SMEs within my teams that can help with that validation, because the last thing you want is data that's misunderstood, misrepresented, finding its way onto a dashboard. So you have to delegate, some sort of SMEs that can help validate that data to make sure that what we're representing outwardly is accurate, checked, and correct.
Good. So let's move a little bit on to the role of a global process owner. There's a lot of companies have a GPO role, but none of them are fully empowered. And we have addressed this early on. So what conditions need to be in place for a GPO to really drive change? Let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think you can ask what a GPO does and maybe get a different answer at different companies. And I think if you go to like APQC or Hackett, or you go to some of these benchmarking organizations and talk about, what does a GPO role look like? And I think, benchmark information will tell you that, a GPO should lead an end-to-end process. It should be end-to-end integrated, and they should have authority for decision making. And I think, that's key. Having the authority to change process and the empowerment to change process is key in maybe a high functioning GPO role. And I think the important thing is that they have the support organizationally to make those changes, at region or entity level. But I think the authority is really key in that.
If you had to sum up in maybe one sentence or two sentences, how do you think leadership looks at a GPO role in an organization?
One or two sentences. It depends on the maturity of the organization. So, for example, a company that, might be well into their GBS journey, I think looks at the GPO as a lever, a means to execute a strategy and a means to standardize their operation. I also think, it's a control role too. And by that, I mean, governance and control. It's a role that can look across the organization and say, where are controls the tightest? Where do we need to bring them up a level? How do we make sure that this entity is operating at the same level of control in, approvals, authorizations, et cetera? So I think leadership can look at the GPO role as, an enabler to make sure that they have, the right control in their organization and that they're driving a cohesive strategy across their regions.
So in other words, not a fixer or an enabler.
You're also a fixer. You're always a fixer. Yeah. So, so one thing to think about as the GPO is, some organizations can look at a GPO as a strategy leader, but not necessarily an operations leader. So if you are, and I've worked in both capacities where I'm a GPO in strategy and I'm driving the global process strategy and, designing the processes and the teams and the way we're going to work. But, also have the operation. So, if you have both strategy and operation, you're always a fixer too, if you have the operation.
As being a GPO, you work across procurement, AP, and finance. Where do teams struggle to work together the most, and how can they improve that?
I would say, and I'll maybe add an element into this. You talked about AP, finance, sourcing. I would say IT too. And I would say that might be a part where a natural struggle or friction point comes along. I find, in any company, the ability for the business or the function, so I'll say P2P in this case, to explain to maybe my IT counterparts about why I need an enhancement, why I need a systems change, why I need to consider something specific. Sometimes, depending on the relationship and depending how that works, can be a little challenging to do, to explain, like, we have to do this because the business impact or the functional aspect is this, or, that can sometimes be challenging. And understood that there's a finite capacity of your technical teams. So you're up against competing priorities, but trying to balance, why you might need something in the grander scheme of, what all is needed across the organization. My personal feeling is that, AP and sourcing can talk pretty well together. I think depending, on how much you've built that relationship, they can kind of speak the same language a little bit more quickly.
So from an end-to-end point of view, so your current setup is that you're sourcing your procurement and AP can really, there's visibility amongst each other? Yeah,
it's taken time though. Depending on, when your GBS organization went into play or whatever your model is, the longer that those groups get time to bond, mesh, work together, be on site, workshop, have a Kaizen, like do those things. I think that helps grow it. So if you've done that 10 years ago, you're probably, pretty functional. If you're fresh into that, there's probably still some growing pains. But I think I guess I'm old school like that. The quicker you can get people working together, and if there's an opportunity to do it live, you're going to grow much quicker.
Anything else that maybe you can share regarding this that our listeners can take as being a strategic point? How did you get to this process? Because there is a lot of organizations where there is still a separation between procurement and AP. Yeah. Any advice that you can share with us?
There's no magic bullet. And it takes time and efforts, and it comes down to relationships. I think you're not going to walk into an organization or walk into, a culture and be able to mesh, mend, or, bring together, with just a conversation or, a request. You're going to have to show and prove that you both want the same thing, which is, your organization's success or a streamlined flow path. You want to help them get their transactions through as quick as you do. And I think you have to find that mutual ground and showcase that you're both working towards the same ends. But I think it comes down to a lot of relationship and building that up and building the trust that you're there for each other.
It's a unified goal.
Yeah, I think you have to find that common ground.
Let's go a little bit into the technology and P2P and opportunities, lessons, and the impact. We did unpack this a little bit early on, but let's deep dive a little bit more in AI and automation as it's shaping a lot of P2P discussions. Where do you see the biggest opportunities, and where do expectations still outpace reality in today's world?
Well, we talked a little bit about customer service. I think that's natural. I think that we'll see that across GBS. So all of the basic inquiry, I think, to some extent, if it's rules-based, policy-based, that can be answered. I see a lot of good functionality in chatbot, policy interpretation. So even there's probably a good play in T&E too. So I'm thinking about policy interpretation questions, maybe even audit there. I think that's where I still want to get a little bit more comfortable about, integrity of response when we talk about audit. The other piece that, I'm excited about is translation services. So, for big global companies where you're serving, 10, 20 different entities in different locations that have some language support required. I mean, we're leaning heavily into the very basic, functionality that's in Teams and translation, and and that gives us a bit of a help. But there's some pretty sophisticated translation, offerings that are coming out that I think could be really interesting and useful.
Let's go to the success and leadership part in your organization. So, what is a commonly used P2P metric nowadays that can be very misleading?
Well, I think, any measure can be misleading if you don't have the definitions right next to it. So, always cautious to showcase a dashboard and then have the definitions immediately after it. I think maybe the most confusing is when people flash cycle time measures. Cycle time measures on rec to PO, cycle time measures on invoice processing. It doesn't always show the stops and starts at the business level, which I think is important. So if you're going to talk about cycle time, I do think you need to break it a bit and talk about, where it sits and when for how long without, making it too cumbersome. I also think, maybe always being a little careful around cost to serve measures. So, what definitions or what benchmark are you going against on cost to serve? Cost per invoice, all of those types of things. Are you using, a Hackett defined definition? Are you using, X defined definition? So being really clear about what's included or excluded. Sometimes people are looking at just if you touch the transaction versus entire, scope of service.
If you had to measure P2P improvements, what should you say should be focused on today?
Well, as much as I mentioned cost to serve, I think, cost to serve is the best indicator of, are you progressing and are you getting better? Are the things you're focusing on improving your process? So I don't think that it has to be incredibly complicated, but I do think you want to baseline as early as you can around cost to serve. And as long as you're clear from a definition, I think that that's a great indicator of, are you progressing quarter over quarter? I also think people should be focused on TAT times. And if you're not, I think you need to be. That's always an area where you're going to be challenged and hear noise around. So the quicker that you have accessible data to showcase TAT times and metrics around that, I think is really important.
How do you demonstrate the broader value of automation when leadership is primarily focused on cost savings? Cost savings is big for any organization today, but how do you demonstrate the broader value of that?
Well, I think you have to bring in a bit of the voice of the customer then too, because cost is king. You can showcase your cost to serve. You can showcase that automation is actually helping your organization, reduce costs, that you're reinvesting in other projects. You can showcase, I've taken this freed up time and did this cleanup project. I focused this time and cleaned this up. So you can showcase all of the good work that you can do with some of that free time. But I think you're going to have to pull in the voice of the customer then too, to also showcase the ease on the business. in whatever way that is. Maybe you if you're using a case management tool, you can showcase how much quicker you're becoming. But also there's maybe, some NPS scores, some other things that you can look at to help, bring in the efficiency in the organization.
Let's address the future of P2P and leadership, specifically to your role as being in GPO. There's quite a lot of synergies and discussions and decisions and that's been made. But what's one shift in leadership thinking that could have a big impact on the P2P future of P2P?
Maybe two areas. One, I would probably say, controls. So a focus on, I guess there's a natural tendency that I'm constantly, focused on VMD and focused on payments and fraud attempts and T&E as well. There's a sophistication in fraud attempts that is growing, concerning, ever changing. So I think that's one area that I'm interested to see, how leadership in any organization approaches and maybe changes policy, changes appetite for controls around that, because the sophistication is just ever changing and unique, and people are very creative in those attempts. So that's one piece that I'm kind of thinking about when it comes to like leadership perspectives on the future. The second is we talked about this AI strategy. How will companies partner with organizations? I think large companies naturally, if I'm a CIO, I'm naturally thinking I don't want to partner with 20 AI organizations. I want to have a strategic partner of 2 or whatever that case will be. So I'm interested to see how organizations decide to structure their AI, strategy and journey. And, I doubt that'll be driven at a function level, right? I don't think it'll be every function choosing the partner they want to work with. I think there'll be, broader, more cohesive, intentional relationships built.
Yeah, much more aligned, because every business and organization is going to have a different process. So it's got to make sense at the end of the day. Yeah, completely agree with you. Looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest challenge or opportunity for P2P leaders in the next 5 years?
I think that like all of the technology changes are table stakes, right? Like all of the advancements in OCR, the end-to-end platforms like Ariba and Coupa, all of that. I think that's table stakes. I think, the must-dos will be like catching up and being on the front end of all of the changing regulatory e-invoicing requirements across, some of the regions that are enforcing that. I think, that'll be a challenge, doing that, but also, in a GPO world, trying to standardize and globalize. So, how do I make everything uniform, or try to make it as uniform and clear and simple steps, processes, but have this unique Romania requirement or this unique, China requirement. So that's part of it. The other thing that I'm thinking about in terms of challenges is this, I'm learning more about, right now is one of the most interesting times in terms of generations in the workforce. So I have, really interesting workforce with Gen Z, with older demographics, having everyone work together. So that's also a dynamic, especially with, changing perspectives on hybrid work environments. Are we in the office, not in the office? Yeah.
Very interesting. I can imagine to manage that and align and understand how people work, the different groups, younger ages of groups, very, very, very different. Definitely different from what I am. I think I'm a little bit more on the old school part. But can we unpack just in a few sentences a little bit more the e-invoicing scenario that you're bringing up? Because there's different policies and legislations, as you mentioned, into different regions. Is there a specific way that you are looking at this and addressing this, or any advice you can maybe share how to take this to a next step? Because this is a real challenge. It is something to look at, and you need to be aligned to it.
Yeah. My guidance would be, I'm a part of this. So we have different councils, in our organization looking at this. So, you have to be on the front end. It's not something you can be late with, and it's not something you can be flexible on. So you have to be ready. So if you don't have it yet, organize a council, make sure that you have the right people at the table, observing and absorbing this information. And for like absolutely a P2P person should have a seat at that table. If you're not on the front end, you should definitely be a part of that council, or if not, helping to drive that. But you have to be receiving that information early and often, because it does change. These dates are moving.
Definitely agree. So this, if you could leave for P2P leaders with one key message, something you should truly take to heart, what would it be?
Maybe just a couple easy points. I would say, first I'll say OCM is your best friend. I'll say that because there's a lot of change happening in P2P. We mentioned all of these things, and I think that you don't overlook the opportunity around organizational change management. So if you don't do that well, it'll make all of these changes so much more challenging. So really consider how much you need to reinvest in OCM, how much you need to educate, really think about, what people need to know and how simple and digestible you can make that information for them. I think that goes a long way in your success in some of these changes.
So Molly, this brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you. It was great having you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, follow our channels or sign up at transparentglobal.com for more insights.